The aisle lighting test reached its warmest cue when the planner on the bride's mark looked toward the console and said something complimentary about his work. "I'd need a groom for that," Garrett answered, glancing back at Sloane from behind the lighting board where his daughter sat with her homework. The way he said it told her his life held loss and a child who needed him. Stay until you see how a quiet lighting vendor builds a foundation strong enough to protect everyone he loves. Garrett Hollis rolled his first equipment case onto the loading dock of the Brevard Mill at 7:15 in the morning, the casters humming against the concrete, and found Dale Renwick standing directly in the path to the freight doors with a clipboard in one hand and a headset hanging around his neck like a second collar. The production director stood in his mid-30s, wearing a freshly printed badge on a lanyard that already looked official. He turned to the woman standing near the doorway, a clipboard in her own hands, and gestured toward Garrett the way you gesture toward a piece of equipment that has arrived on schedule. "This is our lighting execution for the showcase," Dale said. Garrett set the case down, straightened his back, and corrected him the way a person corrects a child who has mispronounced a name for the third time. "Garrett Hollis. Hollis Lighting." Margot Ashford looked up from her clipboard long enough to register that he had spoken, nodded once without stopping the motion of her pen, and delivered an instruction about the load-in timeline that was already 3/4 of the way past him as she turned and walked down the corridor. Her shoes made a sharp, precise sound on the polished concrete, fading into the cavern of the ballroom before Garrett had finished lifting the case over the threshold himself. He unloaded the rest of the equipment onto a cart in a single continuous motion born of 1,000 identical mornings. A roll of gaffer tape, a bag of gel samples, a worn leather field notebook held shut with a rubber band, and Piper's backpack, which she had left in the van after her studio session the night before. He set the backpack on top of the notebook, where he would not forget it, and pushed the cart through the freight doors into the main ballroom. The ballroom rose cathedral high, its century-old red brick softened by new white plaster that still carried the faint smell of fresh application, with matte black steel trusses running the length of the ceiling. The polished concrete floor reflected the morning light in long, dusty rectangles. At the center of the room, the 24-foot circular canopy hung undecorated, suspended on 4 hoists, its bare frame looking like the skeleton of something that had not yet been given its skin. Garrett saw the cable path before he had taken 3 steps into the room. Dale's team had laid a run of feeder cable directly across the main aisle near the temporary drape, creating a rise that would catch the heel of any vendor carrying a load because the production director was moving too fast to see the floor. He did not look for Dale or call out across the room, but instead knelt on the polished concrete, traced the cable path with his fingers to find the nearest anchor point, and rerouted the line along the base of the wall, taping it down at intervals with the flat of his hand. It took him under 4 minutes. When he stood up, the cable was invisible against the baseboard, and the aisle was clean. Holt Creighton walked into the ballroom carrying a lockout kit. He was a man in his late 50s with a deliberate economy of movement that comes from 30 years of trusting your hands over your eyes. He set the kit down at the faux position, walked to the center of the room, and looked up at the undecorated canopy for a full 45 seconds without speaking. Then he nodded once, the way a person nods when they have confirmed what they already knew. "The canopy is sound," Holt said. He walked to the smart motor distro that sat on a table at the faux position, a rented unit with a data logging drive built into its central distribution box, and inspected the pendant key interface with the same quiet attention he had given the canopy. He switched off the main power toggle and withdrew the brass pendant key, turning the key itself into the physical lockout. He placed the pendant key into a tamper-evident envelope, sealed it with the pressure of his thumb, and held it out to Dale. Dale took the envelope. Holt produced a clipboard of his own, a chain of custody form already filled out with the date and the serial number of the envelope, and both men signed it at the bottom. The form stated plainly that the seal could not be broken without revised point load calculations submitted and approved in writing. Dale pocketed the envelope without looking at it, the way you pocket a receipt you will never need again, and climbed a ladder to mount a production GoPro on the truss. He adjusted the angle until the lens pointed directly at the temporary backstage drape area, tightened a mount, and climbed back down. That evening, the studio bay in Waynesville held the steady hum of a desktop fan and the amber glow of a single par congealed with a warm straw. The light falling across the workbench where Garrett sat programming cues on his console. The console's display cast a soft blue wash over his hands, and he moved to the sequence the way you move through a sentence you have already memorized. Piper sat cross-legged on a rolling chair in the booth, the amber light catching the side of her face as she worked on a printed run-of-show sheet spread across her lap. A hinged tin case of colored pencils lay open beside her, and she had arranged the pencils in a gradient that she adjusted every few minutes, pulling one out, setting another back. "Look, Dad," she said. He turned from the console. She held up the sheet, pointing at a section where she had layered two pencil colors side by side, a pale blue and a deeper indigo, the edge between them softened by the pressure of her hand. "This one's better because of the one next to it." Garrett looked at the layered colors, at the way the two tones leaned into each other, and let the silence hold in the room for a long time. "Can you show me how you did that?" he said. Piper picked up the pale blue pencil and held it out to him, and the amber light fell across her hand the way it fell across his. And the studio hummed on around them. Garrett arrived at the main ballroom before the rest of the focus crew, standing at the faux H position beside the rented smart motor distro to look at the 24-foot canopy suspended in the center of the room. By the time Dale arrived with the printed credit sheets, Garrett had already roughed in the first 6 PAA cans. A venue assistant worked on a lift near the back wall, adjusting a fixture to Garrett's ham signals. Dale walked through the room distributing sheets to every vendor lead he passed. But when he reached the faux H position, he held the stack against his clipboard. "We're calling the lighting concept an in-house collaboration on the showcase credits," Dale said, pitching his voice to reach the assistant on the lift. "Margot and I worked the core design before you came on." Garrett said nothing. He turned back to his console, pressed the channel key for the next fixture, and raised his hand to guide the assistant. He had learned a long time ago that arguing about a credit line did not make the light fall any better on the bride's face. During a short break between focus passes, Garrett stood at the console and pulled a working sheet from his bag. He did not reach for the load charts or open the binder of manufacturer specs. He simply looked up at the 4 hoist positions where the steel cables met the truss and wrote. He knew the asymmetric point loads because he had calculated them 3 times in his head that morning. The canopy's decorative weight ran higher than the original spec, and the distribution was uneven. He wrote the figures in his distinctive field shorthand, a system of arrows, fractions, and circled numbers that meant nothing to anyone who had not spent hours watching him annotate a drawing. Each hoist position got its own line, with the calculated load and safety margin beside it. Sloane Whitaker entered the ballroom through the main doors carrying a rolled set of floor plans and stopped at the center aisle. She stood near the bride's mark on the concrete floor, watching Garrett work. She went very still. It was the small movement of a person seeing something they recognize but do not yet understand. She watched him annotate the working sheet without reference or hesitation, and she filed the question in the quiet space behind her professional composure, keeping it to herself. Dale walked over to the faux watch position with Margot Ashford, the two of them deep in conversation about the production schedule. Dale glanced at the working sheet spread across the console without stopping or asking what the numbers meant. "Lighting math," Dale said to Margot, gesturing at the sheet with the back of his hand. "These fixtures guys all learn the same formulas." Margot nodded, her eyes already moving past Garrett to the rigging team. "We need to push the load-in window," she said, speaking past him the way you speak past a piece of furniture. "The floral team is running behind." They moved toward the production corridor together. Garrett watched them go, then folded the working sheet and put it in his pocket. When the rigging meeting convened in the backstaging area, Dale stood at the entrance with a sign-in sheet and held up one hand when Garrett reached him. "You're not needed for this," Dale said. "We're covering the hoist schedule and trim heights. Stick to your focus work." "I need the updated load specs," Garrett said. "If the decorative weight changed, the point loads shift. I need to know what the hoists are carrying." Dale turned away. I'll send you the numbers when they're finalized. He did not send them. The early afternoon, during a production walkthrough near the suspended canopy, Margot and Dale stood beneath the bare frame. The floral team's preliminary rigging was already adding weight to the northeast quadrant. Garrett stood at the edge of the group. The decorative ring is adding weight unevenly, Garrett said, pitching his voice for the group. If the design changed, the hoist positions need to be rebalanced. Dale turned, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had already decided the question was closed. Stick to your fixtures, Dale said. Garrett looked at Dale, then at Margot, who was checking her watch. He looked at the 4 hoist positions where the math was already drifting from the numbers on his folded sheet. He stepped back, choosing not to escalate, yielding the floor to the hierarchy he could not force to listen. The aisle test came late in the afternoon, after the room had cleared and the only sound was the distant clatter of the loading dock. Sloane stood alone on the bride's mark at the center of the aisle, looking up at the canopy. Garrett brought up the warm focus from his console, the amber wash he had built that morning, turning the century-old red brick into something soft and golden. The light fell across Sloane's face, catching the stillness in her posture as she stood on the mark. He looked at her from the console, his hands resting on the faders, and said it quietly. You'd make a beautiful bride. Sloane turned her head, holding his gaze. The light caught the side of her face and something in her expression shifted, an easing of the professional tension. I'd need a groom for that, she said. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of something more than a joke. Above them, in the shadows, the canopy hung massive and unverified, its weight shifting as the floral installation settled, and Garrett watched the darkness above the amber wash with the knowledge that he was now locked out of the math that would keep it in the air. The florist on the scissor lift pushed another saturated foam panel into the canopy's steel armature, her arms wet to the elbows while she fitted the heavy rigging into place. Water dripped onto the concrete 24 feet below in a steady rhythm, and each piece of wet foam she added made the aluminum frame sag a fraction more. Garrett sat at the front-of-house console, his hands resting on the armrests while he watched the northeast hoist. The amber wash from the previous day remained loaded in the board's memory. But the room required someone to look at the northeast quadrant and see the danger building within the structure. The steel cable on the northeast hoist angled inward, pulling the truss member above the quadrant out of level with the rest of the canopy. The difference was marginal, the kind a person could miss if they were not looking for it. But Garrett had been looking at suspended loads for 22 years, and he knew what a frame looked like when it was asked to carry more than its design allowed. Dale stood directly beneath the hoist, his head tilted back, pointing upward with a tablet. More volume on that side, Dale said, his voice flat in the cavernous room. Pack it in tighter. I want it looking like it grew out of the frame. Garrett stood from the console and crossed the ballroom floor, stopping just outside the drop zone where the wet concrete marked the boundary between safe and unsafe. He did not step under the hoist, but looked up at the sagging quadrant and then down at Dale. The rigger, Garrett said. Is he coming back to recalculate before you fly this to trim height? Dale turned away from the lift, looking at Garrett the way a person looks at an uninvited interruption. The canopy remains static, he said. We are not flying it to trim until after the rehearsal. It stays where it is. The weight on that quadrant has changed since the rigger signed off, Garrett said. You added saturated foam and steel armatures. The point loads are different now. Dale did not answer, turning back to the lift and pointing at a gap in the greenery, gesturing for the florist to fill it. Garrett stood at the edge of the drop zone for 3 seconds before stepping back, yielding the space because standing where he was not wanted achieved nothing. He walked back to his console, sat in the dark wood chair, and opened his laptop next to his field notebook. He drafted an email, keeping the language observational as he described the added decorative weight, the change in the frame's alignment, and his formal recommendation that the canopy remain grounded until the rigger reviewed the new load distribution. He addressed it to Dale and added Sloane Whitaker to the copy line, attaching it to an ongoing thread regarding the Tuesday rehearsal schedule, burying the subject line where only a person looking for it would find it. He hit send and left the laptop open on the desk. Across the ballroom in the catering staging area, Sloane Whittaker checked a linen count when her phone lit up on a prep table beside a stack of ivory napkins. Glancing down at the lock screen the way a person checks a clock when unsure of the time, she read the subject line and the first 2 lines visible on the notification bubble. She caught the gist of a loading concern, a detail about the canopy, and Garrett's recommendation for the rigger to check the weights. Without opening the email or scrolling to read the rest, she dropped the phone into her bag and walked across the ballroom floor. Margot Ashford stood outside the production office door with a clipboard in one hand, scanning the room like an auditor assessing a floor plan. She reached for the handle when Sloane stopped directly in her path. "Margot," Sloane said, her voice steady. "I need a minute." Margot lowered her phone, checking the time. "Make it quick. I have the rehearsal walkthrough in 20. Garrett flagged a loading concern about the canopy, Sloane said. He sent an email requesting the rigger recheck before we move it. We should include him in the next rigging discussion. Margot stood with her hand on the office door handle, looking past Sloane at the chaotic ballroom, at the florist on the lift, and at the northeast quadrant where the frame sagged under the asymmetrical weight. The room was full of noise and the sharp smell of wet greenery, and a timer counted down to the opening showcase. "I will consider it after the rehearsal," Margot said, turning the handle and slipping into the office as the door clicked shut behind her. Sloane stood in the corridor, looking at the closed door while the answer hung hollow in the air. Behind her, in the cavernous ballroom, the canopy waited heavy and unbalanced above the floor, and nobody was looking at the northeast quadrant the way Garrett had looked at it. The rehearsal was 40 minutes old when Dale Renwick walked to the front of house position, carrying a small envelope with a broken tamper evidence seal. He set it beside the console and pulled out the pendant key, a brass object that fit into the controller like a key into an ignition. Garrett sat at his lighting console with his hands resting on the faders, watching the ballroom fill with caterers and road cases. The florist was still adjusting the northeast quadrant, and the steel cable above it carried a slight inward angle that had not been there an hour ago. A shift, Garrett noted the way a sailor notes a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Dale inserted the key and turned it, lifting the heavy pendant from its cradle without calling for a spotter or stepping out to check the load distribution. "Fine trim," Dale said to no one in particular, his thumb finding the slow move button. "Slow and fine." Garrett looked up from his console. "You're flying it now? The canopy stays where it is," Dale said, keeping his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I am just taking up the slack on the northeast line by a few centimeters and the rigger can recalculate tomorrow." Garrett opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Dale pressed the button. The motor engaged with a grinding hum that traveled through the pendant, and for 3 seconds the northeast corner of the canopy rose exactly 7 centimeters before the asymmetric weight found its absolute limit. The overloaded northeast connection took the shifting load, buckling the frame inward with a sharp sound like a heavy tree limb breaking under winter snow. The 24-foot canopy tilted violently, its southwest corner dropping toward the concrete floor as the northeast corner rose against the compromised hoist. Dale's hand locked on the pendant in a panic grip, his thumb staying pressed hard against the button, frozen as an extension of the machine. The motor continued to grind, pulling the canopy further out of level while the draped LED floral net began to slide from its anchors, dragging the freestanding floral wall behind it. 2 flower girls were playing behind that wall, crouching on the polished concrete floor, unaware the structure above them was falling. Garrett stood, his hand crossing the desk to find Dale's wrist and lock it in place with a grip possessing 12 years of road strength. His other hand came down flat on the pendant, his fingers finding the red e-stop button by touch and pressing it down until it clicked into the locked position. The motor went silent, leaving the canopy hanging still, but the freestanding floral wall was already past its tipping point, leaning at an angle that would bring it down in another second. Garrett released Dale's wrist without a word and lunged across the concrete floor. He reached the floral wall just as it began to fall, grabbing the heavy steel clips connecting the sagging net to the freestanding frame and yanking them free. The physical connections snapped. free from the canopy's drag, the floral wall rocked backward on its weighted base, settling into equilibrium mere inches from the two flower girls. Garrett knelt beside them. "Let's go find your mothers." He led them past the leaning wall and the sagging canopy, never looking back at Dale, who stood at the desk with his hand frozen on the pendant and a face the color of dry paper. Back in the production office, Dale compiled his incident report, claiming the mechanical bind was caused by Garrett's moving light fixtures snagging the drape. The production GoPro footage was edited to begin after the tilt had already occurred, erasing the first 7 seconds of the disaster. He omitted the warning email, gambling that because Sloane had not raised the issue before the rehearsal, she either had not read it or had lost it in the morning's chaos. He buried it, hoping the sheer confusion of the accident would erase it permanently. Margot Ashford issued a statement to the local media declaring an equipment malfunction and stating the vendor had been suspended pending an investigation. Following her insurer's guidance, she suspended all vendor access to the ballroom, a decision Dale spread by weaving the word ban into every conversation. 3 separate bookings canceled within 48 hours, including corporate events and a seasonal gala scheduled for the spring. 72 hours after the incident, a certified letter arrived at the Waynesville studio printed on Margot's attorney's letterhead, containing a litigation hold, a notice of liability, and a formal declaration that his insurance policy was frozen. Garrett read the document while standing at the studio workbench, reading it twice before setting it down beside the heavy park and illuminating the room. Sloane Whitaker called him later that evening, her voice flat and precise. "My attorney advised me that I am not allowed to share the email," she said. "The process is in the insurer's hands now, and I cannot send you anything related to the incident." Garrett listened to the silence on the line. "I understand, but I did send Margot a formal demand," Sloane continued. "I demanded they preserve all on-site equipment for the insurance investigation, including the smart motor distro and the pendant, which they cannot return to Dale until the investigation is complete." The controller was trapped on the property, its digital data log intact, waiting for someone who knew how to read it. The studio in Waynesville was quiet when he walked through the door later that night, the amber park casting its warm light across the desk where Piper sat with her colored pencils. She was packing them into the tin case, one by one, fitting each pencil into its designated slot. Garrett sat down across from her, the wooden workbench between them holding the cracked leather notebook, the unpaid invoices, and the small desk light. Piper placed the last pencil in its slot, closed the lid with a soft snap, and set the dented tin case in her backpack. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying the plain logic of a 9-year-old watching her father's world collapse. "Is it because you have to come home early for me that they won't let you do the lights anymore?" The question hung in the room. Garrett sat still with his hands resting on his knees, looking across the desk at his daughter. "No," he said. "That is not why. That was never why." Piper watched him for a moment. "Choosing you was the easiest decision I ever made," Garrett said, stating it as a permanent fact. "But I made a mistake after that. I thought that if I kept my head down, if I made myself small and quiet, the world would leave us alone to build our life. I thought shrinking was the same thing as being safe." He looked at the shadows in the corner of the room, feeling the weight of the past 5 years. "It isn't. When you hide what you are capable of just to avoid conflict, you don't buy peace. You just hand over the control of your life to people who don't care if things fall apart. I won't do that anymore." Piper held his gaze, the worry slowly leaving her expression, replaced by a quiet understanding. She reached down into her backpack and pulled out a stack of folded papers. "I made these," she said, handing them across the workbench. "For the run of show. I colored in the cues exactly the way you showed me." Garrett took the papers, his fingers brushing against the colored pencil marks mapping out the progression of the evening. The blue cue sat at the exact timestamp he needed, and he laid the papers flat on the workbench. He reached for the worn leather-filled notebook sitting at the corner of the desk and opened it to a clean page. Its cover was cracked from years of heavy use, and its pages were filled with the distinctive shorthand developed over 12 years of documenting complex loads and angles on the road. The notebook lay open under the amber light, its graph paper pages ready for the true physics of what happened in the ballroom. He picked up his pen and began mapping the load distribution. Margot Ashford's attorney opened the formal vendor and insurer review by outlining the scope of liability and the binding nature of the findings, his voice carrying the weight of institutional process across the Brevard Mill conference room. The mid-morning light fell through the industrial windows in long, dusted angles, illuminating the worn leather field notebook that lay closed on the concrete table. The insurance adjusters sat along one side of the table with their binders open. Holt Creighton sat opposite them, his hands resting flat on the surface the way a man rests his hands on a tool he knows how to use. Garrett sat across from Margot and Dale. He wore his canvas work jacket loose over his shoulders, and he reached into his bag without hurry, pulling out the printed lighting console show file and sliding it toward the adjusters. The time-stamped record proves no lighting cue moved the canopy during the 11-second window of failure, Garrett said. He spoke with the steady, measured tone he used when explaining a load calculation to a junior rigger. The console was in standby mode at the moment of the incident. No signal was sent to any motor or fixture. The adjusters examined the file, passing it between themselves. Holt leaned forward and placed the extracted smart motor distro data log in the center of the table, the printed readout showing the precise sequence of events recorded by the pendant controller. This log was preserved because Sloane Whitaker's equipment freeze email prevented the rental from being returned, Holt said, his finger tracing a line across the numbers. The pendant key ID on this log proves an unauthorized trim command was initiated at 1943-22. The command came from a controller that was not logged into the venue's authorized operator roster. Holt looked up from the readout and fixed his gaze on Dale. "Can you produce the sealed chain of custody envelope for the pendant controller?" Dale sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the edge of the table. He did not reach into his bag. He did not speak. He sat there as the silence grew longer than any pause that could be explained by a man searching for a document, and the room understood what the quiet meant. Garrett reached into his bag and pulled out his field notebook, opening it flat to the reconstructed load map he had drawn the night before. The graph paper pages lay exposed, the color-coded points and the circled X notation marking the exact location of the failure. He traced his finger along the line of the asymmetric weight shift. "The mechanical bind story is physically impossible," Garrett said. "The weight distribution at the northeast connection created a side load failure. The trim command exacerbated what was already unstable. The load map proves the canopy was failing before any trim command was initiated." Holt leaned over the table to examine the diagram. His eyes moved across the notations with the careful attention of a man who had seen that particular language before. His gaze stopped on the circled X and the color points, and he looked up at Garrett with a slow, deliberate nod that carried professional respect. "Lattimore Touring Shorthand," Holt said. The words landed in the room with the weight of a door opening. "You're a high steel rigger." The room shifted. Adjusters looked at Garrett with a different kind of attention, and Margot's attorney stopped taking notes. The recognition settled into the space between them the way a missing dimension suddenly gives a shape its depth. Sloane Whitaker reached into her folio and slid a printed copy of the warning email to Margot's attorney, placing it beside the other documents. "I archived this email 2 hours before the failure," Sloane said. "Mr. Dale received it and omitted it from his compiled incident file." Margot pulled the 3 pieces of evidence together in front of her. Her hands moved with the careful precision of a woman assembling the pieces of a story she had been told wrong. She read Holt's final summary, scanning the page the way a person reads a document when they already know the conclusion, and then she turned toward her attorney. "Draft a settlement agreement for Mr. Hollis immediately," she said, her tone flat and final, leaving no room for discussion. "And pull Dale's access." Dale did not look up. He kept his hands flat on the concrete, his shoulders slightly slumped, the authority he had carried into the room dissolving the way a structure falls when a load-bearing wall is removed. Garrett leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of his notebook, and he stopped the punitive momentum with a single sentence. "I don't want a spectacle," he said, speaking no louder than a statement of fact. "Send corrected notices to every vendor who received the grapevine version. Compensate for business disruption and lost wages." He looked directly at Margot, the edge of his voice sharpening just enough to make the room hold its breath, and guarantee full employment protection for the junior crew who were on shift. They knew things were wrong, but they were terrified of a production director who bullied them. Real authority is supposed to protect the people under it, not use them as shields. He paused, looking down at the open graph paper, tracing the line of a load calculation with his thumb before lifting his gaze back to Margot. "Finally, institute a structural rule," he said. "A requirement for revised point load calculations before any canopy movement after decorative changes, so this doesn't happen again." Margot nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of an agreement that would outlast the settlement. Garrett closed the notebook. The leather cover settled against the pages with a soft sound, and he packed it into his bag the way a man packs the only thing he truly owns. He did not wait for an apology. Without looking at Dale, he stood, buttoned the top button of his shirt, and walked toward the door with the same steady pace he had used when he walked into the room, carrying the quiet resolution of a man who had finally spoken the truth that no one had asked for. Margot Ashford stood near the center of the Brevard Mill ballroom floor, a folder of documents held against her chest. She watched Garrett walk through the door with the same steady pace he had used when he walked out of the hearing room. He crossed the polished floor without hurry, his boots making the soft sound of leather on wood. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands resting at his sides. Margot extended the folder toward him. "The decor change rule is adopted as venue policy," she said, her tone carrying the flat quality of a woman reading from a document she had written herself. "Effective immediately. Revised point load calculations are required before any canopy movement after decorative weight changes." Garrett took the folder and opened it. He did not speak, but his thumb traced the edge of the page with a slow, deliberate motion. Margot pulled a second document from her folder, the pages stapled at the corner. It carried the letterhead of the venue's insurer. "The insurer requires an independent ETCP certified rigger to inspect and sign off on every load-in," she said. "A per-gig contract, not a full-time hire, which a single venue cannot afford." She looked at the document in her hand for a moment, then held it out to him. "I'm offering you an independent creative lighting contract for the venue's wedding events," she said. "Preferred lighting designer with the right to accept or decline individual events. School night hours. No road work." Garrett read the printed terms of agreement in silence. He folded the term sheet and placed it into his pocket, moving with the measured care he reserved for his tools. "I accept the terms," he said. "Have the board draw up the official contract." That evening, in the quiet of his Waynesville studio, Garrett sat at his drafting table with a contract laid open beside his graph paper notebook. The gelled par can cast a warm amber light across the surface. Piper sat across the room at her folding table, her homework spread in front of her and her colored pencils arranged in neat rows beside her hand, the way a child arranges her tools when she has learned from watching someone who values precision. The email notification from his insurer appeared on his phone screen, the subject line carrying the word "renewed" in plain type. He read it once, set the phone face down on the table, and did not pick it up again. The knock at the door was soft, the kind of knock a person uses when she knows she is expected. Garrett crossed the room and opened it. Sloane Whitaker stood on the threshold holding a manila envelope against her side, her coat collar turned up against the evening air. "Official board-signed preferred vendor contract," she said. She stepped into the warm light of the studio and handed him the envelope, her fingers brushing his for a moment longer than the transfer required. He opened the envelope and checked the signatures at the bottom. He set it on the drafting table beside the other folder. Sloane stepped up to the table, standing close enough that he could see her breath moving the collar of her shirt. She looked at the open notebook. "It's a good contract," she said. Garrett looked at her, the amber light catching the edge of her face. "You'd still make a beautiful bride." Sloane smiled. the expression carrying the slow recognition of a woman who had heard the question behind the words. I'd still need a groom for that. He reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers the way a rigger checks a load-bearing lime. I hope you give me a chance to try. Across the room, Piper looked up from her homework. She watched her father, standing tall in the center of the quiet studio he had built for them, holding the hand of the woman who had seen his worth before anyone else did. Piper looked down at her own paper, at the pale blue and the deep indigo she had layered side by side. Her father hadn't needed to erase the master technician to become the quiet dad. He just needed to lay the two colors next to each other so they could make each other stronger. With steady hands, she began packing her colored pencils into their dented tin case, one by one, the way a worker packs up her bench when the shift is finally, beautifully done.